Okay, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction here to Illustrator and kind of talk about how to, a couple different ways you can make this weaving diagram using Adobe Illustrator. So the first thing I want to do is just mention, going back to our initial Photoshop tutorial, I'm using this basket as an example in this tutorial, but I just wanted to show that maybe for this tutorial you could also, mess with the colors, brightness, and contrast a little bit more for the purpose of kind of um, uh, showing it with a little bit less contrast, if that makes sense. So I'm just showing here that I kind of toned it down, made the darker part lighter. That way, it's a little bit easier to see because what we're really looking at is like the weave, the pattern of the weave, and how the fibers move in and out of each other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to save this as a ESD file. So I'll go save as. I've already saved it, so I'll just overwrite it. But you want to save it just as a Photoshop file. And the Photoshop file itself is what we're going to bring into Illustrator. So I'll go ahead and switch over to Illustrator. And just to point out, well, I'll cover that in a second. So I'm going to go over to Illustrator. I'm going to ignore that for right now. So I'll make a new document, File, New, and you should see this menu pop up. And just like with InDesign, we have a few different options up at the top for kind of presets. Again, web is more for digital formats, where we're looking for a certain pixel size or like screen resolution. And print is more for printing. So I'm going to switch to print and go to inches. It doesn't, I think the plan would really be to make this diagram and then use Illustrator, or I'm sorry, use InDesign to kind of compose it in a larger presentation. So I'm not going to pay too much attention to the page size. I just want to use something that's kind of more appropriate for the scale that I'll be doing my presentation at. So I made my page just 8.5 by 11, and then I'll go ahead and click Create. So Illustrator is kind of a lot like InDesign in some ways, but it's really intended more for kind of vector artwork. So we have our page here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'll go to where I saved my Photoshop file, and I'm just going to drag it in from my file browser and drop it right there. I think you can also go to File, Place, just like you would in InDesign, and navigate to where that document is. And just to orient you a little bit, so I'm using Alt Scroll to zoom in and out. I'm holding Space to pan around. If I wanted to adjust, okay, I can do Control R to turn on the rulers. That'll show me my page size. I think you can also get to that in View. So under View, we can go rulers, turn them on and off. There's also a thing in Illustrator called Smart Guides. And basically that just allows you to like line things up when you're drawing with different tools. For example, you'll see when I like draw a line, it'll kind of extrapolate like lines for me so that I know that point is, for example, lined up to this edge of the box. Some people like to have them on, some don't. It's up to you. There's also a thing in here called Snap to Grid, Snap to Pixel, Snap to Point, all of which you can use if you want to kind of use or have a like underlying. So you'll see like when my cursor moves that it's going to snap to like a grid, and I can change the size of the grid. I tend to not use those things, but some people like them. So the other thing here is that you'll notice my toolbars, and I'm using the preset under Window, Workspace, Essentials Classic in this case, just in case you're wondering where any of my toolbars are coming from. Okay, and then last thing, if I wanted to edit anything about this document, I can go to File, Document Setup, and then I'm kind of back to the same set of options that I had at the beginning. So I can change resolution. I can click up here in the right-hand corner and go to Edit Artboards. And then I can change my page size up here, so I can go 8.5 by 8.5 if I wanted to. Or I can just click and drag, make them bigger or smaller. And to exit this, you just hit Escape on the keyboard. And then you can also go to File, I guess up here. Yeah, you can go to Edit, Preferences, and all this stuff in here is kind of like some of the options you have for the size of things and layouts and stuff like that. For example, units are here, all that kind of stuff. You can change, for example, when I apply a stroke to a line right now, I have it in inches. That way I can kind of keep a scale reference in mind, but you could also change it to points or pixels, basically. Just like that. And then you can see it changes to the different units. Anyway, so there's kind of general things for orienting yourself within Illustrator. The other thing that, so what I'm going to do next is kind of start to draw over this image. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to point out, because I actually placed the Photoshop file in this document, I've done something a lot like when we place an image in InDesign, which means that I have it kind of referenced back to the original file. Just to kind of show you an example of what I mean, if I were to turn off this layer mask and bring the background back, and I hit File, Save here, and then when I return to Illustrator, it will ask me if I want to update this document. So that image is still linked to the Photoshop file that I've been using. So that's the kind of benefit there. If I wanted to adjust the color tones or fix up some of the edges with the background, I could still do that. I wouldn't have to replace the image. Okay. So the other thing I'm going to talk about is the layers. It's a really good idea in Illustrator to use layers, but generally speaking, use them a little bit differently than in Photoshop. They work the same way, so you can turn them on and off. You can lock them so that you can't mess them up when you're working. And the order that they are in this panel also affects the order in which they're visible in the canvas. So what I'm going to do right now, because this automatically went onto this layer, I'm just going to go ahead and lock this layer, because what I want to do is trace on top of it without messing it up. And I'm going to make a new layer. So some people like to use different layers just in order to select things. So for example, if I draw a rectangle and draw a line, it can get kind of messy in Illustrator to try and select these things from among a bunch of other stuff in my drawing. And so you can also select objects by layer. So over here on the layers panel, there's the little circle on the right-hand side. And if I click that, then I'll automatically select all the objects that are on that layer. So in general, that's kind of how I like to use Illustrator. I sort things by layer in terms of their appearance. And that way I can edit by just selecting everything on that layer and changing the visibility options for anything there. But we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of try and trace. I'm going to start by trying to trace the stitch of this basket. And there's a couple ways you can do that. One of them is the pen tool. So kind of like what we did in InDesign, we can draw using this tool. And what I'm going to try and do is kind of focus in on this area where the weave is happening. And I'm not going to trace every single line, and you guys don't need to either. That's too much work, and it wouldn't help us visualize the weave anyway. But what I am going to do is kind of start in the area that I want to focus on, and then I'm going to pull my lines out from there. For example, if I want to focus in here, I'm looking right now at this kind of strand. And I think that this basket, let me just go back to the color image so you can kind of tell better. This basket actually has two different materials. I think it's probably yucca and pine needle, although I'm not sure. But anyway, so there's two materials. There's these kind of double lines and then the single lighter white line. So what I want to do is distinguish between those when I trace. But anyway, so I'm going to follow this pine needle line first, kind of out to where I can see it. And just like, again, like in Illustrator, I'm going to trace that line. Or I'm sorry, in InDesign. So when I click with the pen tool, I'm clicking and I'm dragging my mouse. And as I drag my mouse, you can see those little handles appear on my screen, and that's kind of how I'm controlling the curvature. So the length of the handle obviously controls the extent, but that control point kind of impacts my line and the position as well. Okay, so I think that's good. So I'm just going to hit enter, and you can see that my pen tool is no longer connected to the original line. And the reason that I kind of like using the pen tool is it's somewhat easy to edit afterwards. So if I click over up here, I have the same two buttons, or the same two selection tools. I can select an object, like a whole object, for example, this whole line, or I can select with the direct select tool, and that allows me to edit what are called anchor points. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, the anchor points are kind of the essence of Illustrator. So pixels are what you can edit in Photoshop, and vectors are what you can edit best in Illustrator. And InDesign kind of does a little bit of both, but it's mostly just for layout, for composing drawings and documents and things like that. And so I'm just clicking and dragging on each one of the anchor points. If I want to move a handle or a grip on my anchor point, I click first on the center. So I select the line, and I click on the anchor point. You see it highlights the two handles, and then I grab the one that I want to move. And you'll see also when you do this kind of selection, you can edit the anchor points so they're not symmetrical like they are when you're drawing. But anyway, okay. And so there's basically two ways of kind of illustrating. Fundamentally, there's two ways. There is the stroke and the fill. So just like with InDesign, if I draw a closed shape, over here on my color panel, you'll see I have two swatches, and one of them looks like a full box, and one of them looks like the outline of the box, and that's exactly what they are. So if I have the fill selected, or the whole box selected, and I set a color, that's the color that's going to fill in the box. And same goes true, so I'll select the outline and edit the outline, change the color, and so you can't really see that very well. There we go. And so that'll change the color of the outline. And with the outlines as well, I can apply what's called a stroke pattern and weight. So up here in my stroke panel, and again, just in case you're wondering, all these panels are available in the window menu. Let's say you turn them on and off. And so in the stroke panel, I can scale up the thickness of the line. I can also type in custom numbers if I want something that's not a default setting. Again, these are the kind of appearance of the ends of my lines, or the corners of my lines. I can apply a dashed line, and I can set the pattern for it here, just like that. Off the fill there so you can see a little better. So I can apply a dash pattern, and actually I don't know what happens if you apply it. Yeah, I guess it just shows you the beginning and end of the outline. You apply an arrowhead. So you can apply arrowheads. So this stuff is kind of all pretty similar to what we had done in InDesign. Okay. Now there's one other tool that you can use to do this, which is pretty good, and that is the brush tool. So up here, again, there's this brush tool. You can also get to it by hitting B on the keyboard. And the brush tool allows us to draw in a little bit different way. What we do with the brush tool is we just drag it. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so I can see the whole length of my line that I want to trace. Let's try one that's going the other way. So I'm going to click and just try and trace that line as best I can. And it's hard to do with a mouse, but if you had like a drawing pad or something like that, or a pencil and a touch screen, you might find that more appealing. Anyway, and you can see that what happens is it translates my brush movement into a vector. And so just like with before, I can change the weight of that line, and I can do all the dash line things that I had done before. I guess I can't do a dash line. All right, never mind. And if I want to, so it is a little bit different in some respects. But yeah, basically you can still edit the anchor points like you would with a pen tool line. Anyway, so that's an option as well, just so you're aware. Maybe this is interesting. That's crazy. All right. Well, just keep that in mind. Can't turn those into dashed lines. Okay. So what I would start by doing is kind of tracing, let's say, a certain amount of space in here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 lines in one direction and 4 lines in the other direction, and kind of everything that extends into and out of that space. And then I would trace all those lines. Now, the other thing you can do, again, is kind of apply a different appearance to each line. So I would use a color, just applying to the stroke, and try and kind of color code the different directions or the different materials, whatever you think is important to distinguish between, in order to illustrate the weaving pattern. So you'd use different colors to kind of show different elements of the weave. And again, you can use dash lines to indicate things too, if you want to. Okay. And so I've actually done, I did a quick trace on this image beforehand. That way you wouldn't have to watch me trace a bunch of lines. I'm going to go to that document now. Oh, the other thing I should mention is you can also adjust opacity in InDesign on any object. And it is important to kind of think, to be careful of at what level you kind of adjust opacity. But basically, you can select an object and there's an opacity box at the top here. There's also a panel called the transparency panel. And again, that's under Window, Transparency. And then if you select an object, you can kind of change how light and dark and transparent it is in there. So I've actually toned mine down even more just so that the image behind kind of recedes and the tracing lines pop out. And so here's my lines, and I'm actually let me pause real quick here. Okay, so I actually already did what I'm about to show you, so I just wanted to turn that off really quick. So here's my lines, and I've kind of color coded based on material and based on the direction. So the colors of the lines you see. Actually, I guess I didn't quite do that right. So the red lines are like the pine needles, and the white lines are like, or I'm sorry, the yellow. The blue lines are the yucca. So let me just try and correct that quick. And also, that's there is a couple different ways to adjust color. So I want to kind of do it darker tone here. But if I go with the color panel open and I click on the little 3 dash line in the top right corner, I have CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I have hue, saturation, and again, kind of black. And then I have RGB, red, green, blue. And I also have grayscale if I wanted to change my line to just like between white and black. So I actually like to use the hue saturation a little bit more. You can kind of just change a certain part of the spectrum here. And there we go, that looks better. And I think I did this guy here. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, so now my colors are kind of representing the different materials and the different directions. So what I want to do now, because this really just looks even more confusing than trying to figure it out by looking at the basket itself, is add a little bit of transparency kind of selectively to my lines, so I can make them look like they're going forward or backward, like moving in and out of each other, basically. And so what I want to do is use the transparency tool to do that. And because it's a little bit easier, I'm going to select multiple lines at a time. So the way you do that, I'm just selecting a line, holding Shift, selecting another line, another line, another line. So now I have all 4 of those lines selected together. And before I apply a transparency to these, I'm going to group them together. So I believe if you go to Edit, maybe object, go to object, you can hit this button group, or you can also hit Control G on the keyboard, or even maybe right click. Yeah, you can right click, go to group or ungroup. So now this is kind of one object. It is important to note that when you group stuff in Illustrator, it'll automatically put it all in one layer if it wasn't already. So just keep that in mind. But anyway, so I grouped this stuff together, and then I'm going to use my transparency panel down here to make a mask, kind of like what we did in Photoshop. So down here, I'm going to click this button, Make Mask. And you can see right away that what happened was everything disappeared. So the default is for the mask to be set to black. And just like in Photoshop, black means invisible, white means visible, and gray is everything in between. So what I can do is I can go onto the mask itself, and I can start to draw and edit in order to reveal and kind of hide my lines. The first thing I'll do is, so I've clicked over here. This is the mask, right? And this is the artwork. So I've clicked over here on the mask. You can see the blue line has it selected. This gets really confusing and messy if you aren't paying careful attention to where you are. So now I'm actually drawing, excuse me, on the mask. What I'll do first is I'll get the rectangle tool. I'm going to set my fill white and just leave my stroke off. And I'll just draw a big rectangle around the whole thing to reveal those lines again. So now, again, because it's white there, the lines are totally visible. Then what I want to do is go ahead and deselect everything. So I just went back to the selection tool and clicked away on the canvas, or I clicked anywhere where the rectangle isn't. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is add some kind of gray tones to kind of make the areas that are actually hidden or behind other layers of material more transparent. So I'm also going to use the brush tool for this, but you can use it. You can do it a lot of different ways. You could just draw. You could draw different shapes if you wanted to, or you could, make different selections and fill them with color. But I'm going to use the brush tool because it's probably the easiest. And I actually have my brush panel open just for kind of quick stuff. So I want my brush to be the kind of basic, just a straight line. And I want and I use this to kind of swap quickly between different sizes of my brush. So you can see the size of my brush there kind of changes. And I am going to set my brush to black. Actually, not black. I'm going to use a gray tone. I'm going to use this one, which is like, I don't know, 70% dark. And I'm going to set my my stroke to off. And then I'm going to go through and I'm just going to paint my transparency mask where I want my lines to be less visible. Just like that. And because I did this whole group of lines together, and I do them all at the same time. And it doesn't really matter, where I draw, as long as it intersects with the place that the transparency should be. So even though my line's a lot thicker here, that's okay. It's not going to look bad. Okay, and what I'll probably do is pause it and turn my other layers back on real quick. Okay, so here we are with the kind of transparency layers fixed back and turned back on. So the image, again, we can still adjust the kind of transparency of that to make these lines pop out a little more. And again, whenever you're adjusting your transparency, in order to get back out, you just go ahead and click back on the left-hand side there, and then you're back in normal space and you can move between things. We can also, so these objects right now are grouped, which means that they kind of do everything together. They would get selected together and they can move together. But if we want to edit them individually still, we can double click. And so now we're kind of inside the group. And we can select individual lines or all the lines, and we can change them. So we can still adjust the kind of thickness of the lines. We can still adjust the color tone and things like that. Okay. And then to get back out, you can just hit escape, or you can click this little back arrow, go back, double click in here, make these a little thicker. Okay. And then you could also include like arrows and things like that if you wanted to kind of illustrate, the direction and things like that. And then these groups themselves, right? We can still go back and kind of adjust the opacity of the overall group. We can make it lighter or darker if we want to. Okay, and that's kind of it. So you'll want to add some layers of information, like annotation in terms of what you're showing, what the materials are. I would try and identify the style of weave that you're showing. But yeah, so you would want to kind of add some information to this. But that's the kind of general idea. And so when you're done, just like with Photoshop, you want to go ahead and save it. Save it as an Illustrator file for sure, because that's how you preserve the editability of it. Okay. We'll call this our weaving tutorial. Okay. And of course we can also export it if we want to. So PDF is probably the best thing. We go to File, Export, Export As. We can export to PDF. Where are we? Oh, okay. I guess you can't export to PDF. So what you can, in here, I should point out, you can export to JPEG or PNG as well. And sometimes that's kind of really what you want to do. Make sure you hit this button, use artboards, and then you can kind of adjust the quality of it here, just the resolution of it there before you export. But when you save it as a JPEG, it'll flatten it, right? So it'll like turn the vector lines into pixels, basically. You can kind of see now when we zoom in on it, it won't have the kind of editability of the vectors anymore, which is why a PDF is kind of a good thing. So if we go to File, Print, and we select under our printer Adobe PDF, and can set the page size, and usually if we just set it to custom, it'll copy the size of the artboard. We can change the resolution here. 600 dpi is quite high. 300, there we go. Okay. All that looks pretty good. And we'll go ahead and hit print. And then it'll ask us where we want to save things. So we'll save it in that same folder. There we go. Okay. I think that should just about conclude this tutorial, so I will go ahead and sign off.